Gwe Willigiskik. Today I'm presenting a book written by Joanne Archibald, Indigenous Storywork, Educating the Heart, Mind, Body, and Spirit. This presentation will take a look at some main themes throughout her book. I will present acknowledgements, story work, stories, story research as methodology, 4 R's of respect, reverence, reciprocity, and responsibility, and respectful research relationships, finishing with synergistic story power. Next slide, acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. I am a Mi'kmaq woman from the community of Sipekne'katik. Archibald introduces a holistic Indigenous framework, and as she states, I started by saying which reserve and which family I belong to. Among the Stalo, it is still customary to say where and which family you come from, if the elders don't know you, so that those that are listening can place you within your community family history. Identifying one in relation to place and family is part of knowing how one fits within the collective or larger cultural group, which is part of the holistic Indigenous framework. In British Columbia, there are 273 bands with 38 language dialects. She raises her hands and thanks and respect. Archibald wrote her book on a salary, and her royalties go to the Salaska Heritage Foundation for publication and additional books dedicated to in honor and elders. She uses the terms First Nation, Aboriginal, Indigenous, and Indian interchangeably. For example, she also talks about the power of interconnectedness within family, community, nation, culture, and land, versus if you're disconnected from either of the above, you lose the ability to make meaning when listening to stories. Lastly, she talks about permission to enter someone's territory. You must make phone calls, provide letters, and have personal visits. Archibald requested permission on Tribal Council, Cultural Center, and Aboriginal organizations when conducting her research. Next slide, story work. Archibald is learning how to do story research with elders, including Coast Salish elders and Stalo elders. She incorporates 7 principles related to using First Nations Indigenous stories and storytelling for educational purposes, and that's how Archibald came to term using StoryWork. StoryWork stories take on their own life and become the teachers. The 7 principles are respect, responsibility, reciprocity, reverence, holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. Principles are the strands of a cedar basket, and the learning of the stories in this book form a story basket. The principles help Archibald to get to the core of making meaning with and through stories, and she believes these principles must be understood and practiced to use Indigenous stories meaningfully in an educational context. Her book was only completed when she decided to return home, and for Archibald, elders taught her about engaging in story research as methodologies. She sought out guidance from elders from Dr. Simon Baker, Dr. Ellen White, and Dr. Vincent Stogan, who all sat on Cultural Elders Center together. And through her research writing, she had supervised help from Celia Haig Brown. One of the reasons that drew Archibald to storytelling was a dream that she had. And as mentioned, dreams can be a source of Indigenous knowledge and that they can provide guidance for Indigenous research methodology. Archibald coined the term storywork because she needed a term that signified that stories and storytelling were to be taken seriously. This work took Archibald 7 years. Archibald quotes, "To know a story, you must write it in your heart, meaning listening carefully to what is said, keeping whatever is useful, and let the words that you can't use go with the other ear. Thus, coming to know and use Indigenous stories through storywork requires intimate knowing and brings together heart, mind, body, and spirit." Next slide. Stories. Archibald took a long journey with Coyote the Trickster to learn about the core of Indigenous stories from elders. She uses the story of Coyote the Trickster, the coyote, her, his, its, and the stories listed throughout. For example, one story talks about Coyote's eyes, another is Coyote searching for the bone needle. An example is on chapter 1 of Coyote's eyes is to find out how to respect certain types of Indigenous knowledges and to teach, learn in a culturally appropriate way and a fun way to learn balance, seeing the world only through the lens of an oral way and through use of memory. Coyote transform. In English, trickster is a poor meaning and cannot portray the diverse range of ideas. Where, for example, First Nations, trickster can be a magician, enchanter, absurd prankster, shaman, shapeshifter, and take on human characteristics. When used in the written English language to portray a story, it can be very problematic to an Aboriginal storyteller because its framework, principles, values, format may be very different from Aboriginal frameworks. For example, losing humor and meaning that is lost in translation. Storytellers thus have a cultural responsibility and reciprocity in remembering the stories, and that takes repetition in hearing the stories over time. For example, Archibald says that women speak to the moral and spiritual fibers of story, and men speak about the laws of the land. In her book, she talks about voice training. Voice training in the longhouse speaks occur in nature and not in the longhouse, and how one becomes a good storyteller. Frank Malloway says they take them down to small creeks where the learner is on one side and the teacher is on the other, and the learner has to speak to the teacher. They eventually graduate to a bigger river where the teacher tells the learner speaker not to scream but to speak to him. And these are also a way and form of waking up sleeping stories, keeping stories alive, bringing back stories that have been put to sleep in people's memories, and reawakening the memories that hold some of the forgotten stories and reawaken the storyteller ability in the elders. Good story research should enable people to sit together and talk meaningfully about their Indigenous knowledge and could be effectively used for education. Archibald does a great job in listing characteristics of stories. The types of stories can vary from a sacred to historical, from cultural traditions to personal life experiences and testimonies. Some stories are just for fun, while others have powerful teachings. Some stories may be owned, those that are responsibilities of individuals, clans, or families, and some belong to the public domain, being available to anyone to tell. Some stories can be told only at certain times of the year. Next slide, story research as methodology, metaphor of story basket. Archibald uses the story, a bone needle, as an example in searching for culturally appropriate Indigenous research methodology about Indigenous storytelling, starting with the principles of respect, respect for cultural knowledge, respect for the people who owned and shared stories as an ethical guide. In this book, Archibald weaves and designs of Stalo and Coast Salish storytelling basket based on the StoryWork teachings of respect, reverence, responsibility, reciprocity, holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. Archibald uses basket as one metaphor for learning about stories and storytelling. Each basket maker are identified by their designs, each reflecting relationship with family, community, nation, land, and nature. And any time a basket is mentioned, the metaphor, you know it, contains all the stories. For example, a hunter will interpret a story differently than a basket maker, and the basket maker may remember other details, so the story takes on its own life and travels from person to person, taking on different shapes. The process of remembering is like weaving strands of the basket together. Weaving pieces together until a complete story emerge. As the basket maker continues, interweaving the pieces, transforming them into distinctive designs, the baskets themselves is a specific function such as storing items, serving as water and berry containers, and sometimes being used as cooking containers. In the Stalo tradition, a basket maker gives the first basket away to someone who may find it useful. For Archibald, she gives us the StoryWork basket to us as the readers. Sharing what one has learned is an important Indigenous tradition. StoryWork is the process of giving back. Oral traditions is cultural work witnessed through speeches, stories, and songs. Oral traditions are reinforced with communal spiritual reverence of oratory. That is a place of prayer with attempts of persuasion. When starting this journey, Archibald is aware of the contradictions faced when completing academic work steeped in literacy and analysis and explicitness. For example, for those accustomed to be taken from point A to B to C, some stories will be hard to follow. The stories are more like a spider's web with many threads radiating from the center, crisscrossing one another, and thus patience and trust are essential for preparing to listen to stories. To listen with 3 ears, 2 on the sides of our head, and 1 that is our heart. In order for Archibald to find an Indigenous methodology, she had to go back to the elders, to learn from the Stalo story principles in order to find Stalo story theory, to take direction from the elders. Next slide. 4 R's: respect, reverence, responsibility, and reciprocity. Archibald begins each morning asking for guidance from the Creator. A spiritual practice of prayer begins her day and her work. This is creating a cultural learning practice. A prayer is also used to start a discussion with an elder and to finish the discussion with elder. Research experts, outsiders, quickly change to research and cultural learners, as research needs to learn to appreciate the form and process of teacher-learning protocol, that form of communication and social principles and practices embedded in First Nations cultural context. None of these steps is easy, quick, or simple. Through the inquiry, learning process of incorporating cultural respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and reverences. Establishing relationships and taking directions from elders, being culturally worthy or ready, is important to understand the fundamental values of the 4 R's. Being culturally worthy means being ready intellectually, emotionally, physically, and spiritually to fully absorb cultural knowledge. Archibald gained appreciation for the 4 principles in 1. Respecting each other in the cultural knowledge, 2. Responsibility carried out the roles of teacher and learner, 3. Practicing reciprocity so that we can give to one another, and thereby continuing the cycle of knowledge from generation to generation, and 4. Reverent spiritual knowledge in one spiritual being. Next slide. Respectful research relationships. The principles of holism, interrelatedness, and synergy work together to create powerful story work understanding that have the power to help with emotional healing and wellness. Archibald has created a holism diagram that's included, where oneself is in the center, surrounded by family, community, and nation. This has intellectual, spiritual, emotional, and physical connections all on the outside, which again ties to heart, mind, body, and spirit. Archibald works with her elders, remind her to sit down and listen. Basiak Jixiden, as the ancestors used to say, including research as chat, research as conversation, research as storytelling, allowing appreciation and elders maintaining control over what they want you to know. The teacher-learner relationship included cultural ways and protocols where elders decide and determine meeting location, while you ensure that there is sharing of food and tea and create an unhurried time in talking space, and is also disrespectful to ask questions immediately. The protocol is to take time to sit, think about, and feel what we have learned with working with elders. The protocols differ according to the nature of the request and the nature of the individuals involved. Aboriginals that say no to aspects of Western education and research that clash with our cultural knowledges and ways of knowing is that we often feel assaulted by the continued pressures to conform through new ways of colonization, such as government policies and procedures. Archibald explains this through a story of the mink and Miss Pitch. Indigenous story work is not an easy process, but essential to educating the heart, mind, body, and spirit, which is what we mean by Indigenous education. If Indigenous people are involved with publication, their level of participation is noted through authorship, copyright, or introductory remarks as ownership of intellectual property rights through reciprocity. Archibald notes that stories written by outsider professionals such as linguists and anthropologists raises concern for misinterpretation and appropriation, as elders felt that their stories have to have plain language and be open enough for students to expand their minds. Last slide. Synergistic story power. Interrelationship between storytellers created a synergy of story threads to become a basket. The important point that Archibald talks about is relating this story experience, and that the power created during the storytelling session seemed interrelational as it moved among the storyteller and story listeners into a storytelling situation. The interaction created a synergistic power that had emotional healing and spiritual aspect. The synergistic story power also brought the story to life. Becoming a storyteller and experience in the power of StoryWork gave Archibald more confidence to work with story in an educational curriculum designed for school-aged children. Synergistic action happens between storyteller and story. It is storyteller who ultimately gives breath of life to the story. And if stories are learned within contexts where the principles of respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and reverence are not practiced, then their power diminishes or goes to sleep until awakened by those who can use the story power appropriately. StoryWork pedagogy. Teachers' lack of cultural knowledge and reading pedagogy create misperceived, culturally relevant curriculum materials when presented by the outsider. Thus, StoryWork in action. This book, StoryWork in Research, is used as an application in a provincial elementary school level, kindergarten to grade 7 school curriculum, and information from Archibald's chapter came from interviews with curriculum staff, self-reflection, field notes, reports, minutes and meetings, curriculum documents, and teaching materials. Hearing stories from well-respected storyteller makes the oral told story more credible, more real, and that children in classes prefer the nature of human factors of storytelling. Archibald discusses placing Indigenous stories in educational curricula poses another serious question, and those questions are: what is appropriate and who can determine cultural appropriateness, and questions that continue to surface. And if non-Native teachers tell Indigenous stories, how can they do this ethically? Archibald takes time to, within her field notes, to discuss a gut-wrenching reaction when she is listening to a non-Indigenous story or teacher tell an Indigenous story to her students. Actually, it was in her way of telling the story that seemed entertaining. Listening to her, watching her, that bothered Archibald the most because she didn't know any cultural protocol for as whose story was it, who gave her permission to tell the story, and what First Nations culture did the story come from. She reminded Archibald of the coyote showing off new-found knowledge without understanding and respecting its significance. And if non-Native teachers and Indigenous teachers are to use and tell Indigenous stories, they must begin a culturally sensitivity learning process that includes gaining knowledge about storytelling protocol and the nature of these stories. Thus, it is important to hire Indigenous storytellers to tell stories and collaborate work with the classroom teachers on story pedagogy. Added slide for reflection and questions. It is important to end this presentation that we, to become story ready, need to understand colonial impacts, appreciate Indigenous knowledge systems, value relationships, and learn the core of Indigenous stories. Walaliak.